Hi, Misha here, and getting back in the groove. This was the video I planned to do 2 weeks ago for you. And it is actually one of the most interesting and even perhaps exciting new models to come from Corgi this year. For the first time, at least that I'm aware of, they are doing a ship in one 1250 scale. It comes here in this case. And immediately, I'm already liking it because a lot of these, like the Diecast, the Motor City, this plastic is pretty thin. This is chunky. In fact, the whole thing feels very heavy. And then we have it here with placard and the ship. And the body is metal. And actually, even the flight deck is metal, which is pretty unheard of for this scale, this style. So of course your planes and your towers and whatnot are plastic, but full metal body, which means she's heavy. And now you see it here on the plinth with the plaque, but it also came with another option. It came with a water line. Here we go. Now, when these were being marketed, this was installed, so I wasn't sure if this was a full hull or a waterline model. Waterline are kind of common, but I just don't like them as much because you'll never make plastic or rubber or metal look like real water. But this is kind of like Forces of Valor, where they give you both. You can display it either way. There's just two screws on the bottom, and you see this is cut out where it can sit in here. The bow is going through here. It sets in properly. So, neat options. And finally, what do we have here? Well, you've already read it. This is the HMS Prince of Wales, R09. This is Britain's current, I guess you would call it, super carrier or fleet carrier. It's one of two in the Queen Elizabeth class, and Corgi announced both this and R108, Queen Elizabeth herself, last year. And as often happens with Corgi, they were delayed, and as it happens now, Prince of Wales came out before Elizabeth. Oh well, Elizabeth I think is supposed to be due in September. They should look very similar, although I think they do have different aircraft on deck. And this does come with aircraft. Of course, these are in the small scale. And just to help us out, I brought them out here in 1/72 scale. This is the Merlin helicopter. And this is the F-35B, complete in British livery. These are the two main vehicles this was designed to operate, along with other helicopters like Chinook and Wildcat and Apache. But this one actually seems to have either Wildcats or Apaches on deck, and I believe Elizabeth has Chinooks. But since the Merlin is kind of the primary helicopter that both carriers will operate, I've decided to bring it out. It could also be that I was feeling a little lazy, and it came to hand first. So as always, we'll talk about history and get into the model with more detail. Why not? Putting it on the spinny thingy, I'm again impressed by the weight already. I had no idea what to expect because, yeah, Corgi doesn't do ships until now. But it's no surprise that their first ships would be British because it's kind of their primary focus. These are very important carriers for the Royal Navy. In fact, they're the largest warships that they've ever operated, at least up until this time, 2022. And they're among the largest warships in the world today. And this is Britain's return to a true carrier. There were plans, they were still using mostly World War II or at least Korean era vintage carriers, some light, some medium. But in 1966, the white paper kind of canceled plans for their next true full carrier. This is where the Invincible class, so-called through-deck cruisers, essentially jeep or jump carriers, came in that we know from the Falklands War. They would end up building several of those, and they would operate, of course, the Harrier, Sea Harrier, and later the Mark 7 and Mark 9 in the 21st century. They were quite small. I believe they're around 23 tons, give or take. So, yeah, not the biggest in the world. And that's what Britain had to work with, and that was pretty much the way of things for 30 years. But following the end of the Cold War and changing technologies, in 1997, the government commissioned a report, which was delivered in 1998. And the long and the short of it is, it said, look, we need a couple of carriers to project offensive air power around the world. We need to work with the U.S. Navy, kind of use similar, if not the same, fighters. Because abroad, you can't count on bases. Even if there are, you don't know if they're going to be adequate. Look, we need carriers again. Was the gist of it. And so kind of work went ahead. In early 99, the Ministry of Defense announced a competition, and about half a dozen contractors submitted proposals. And in November of that year, it was down selected to two, BAE and Thompson, which would become BAE Systems, and Thales very soon. These would be the two finalists. And the idea was they were going to submit, originally they were thinking 30 to 40 tons. Obviously it would end up growing quite a bit bigger. They were thinking of anywhere from an air group from as small as 30 up to 60, including helicopters and aircraft. And already by 2000 they were eyeing the new Joint Strike Fighter, JSF, in the USA, which eventually would evolve into the XF-35 and eventually the F-35. And they weren't sure if they were going to go with a catapult system, a Cato bar recovery, or continue using ski jump, short takeoff and landing, vertical takeoff and landing. They weren't sure of that. But it was going to operate a mix of helicopters for both utility and early warning, and aircraft for both defense and strike fighting roles. So, in 2001, the British announced they would be partnering with the USA for the JSF program, and then they announced they would be buying the F-35 a couple of years later. And in 2002 or 2003, they announced that Thales won the contract. However, BAE Systems was the prime subcontractor. And they pretty much from that point started working on funding, what exactly they wanted to do. They got into kind of advanced concepts throughout 2004, 2005, 2006. And by 2007, construction contracts were getting ready, which were signed in mid-2008 to begin. And this would be with a new conglomeration, the aircraft, it's the ACA, I always forget that last one, Alliance, that's it, the Aircraft Carrier Alliance Group, which was headed by Thales, but also had lots of other companies, including, of course, BAE Systems and some U.S. partners. It pretty much involved everyone to get these things built. And at this time, they were still thinking about two, but they weren't sure. Even though they were starting construction in 2009, only one was for sure, which would be HMS Queen Elizabeth herself. Her sister ship here was up in the air. In fact, in 2010, they still said they didn't know. They also said that year they were still considering, hey, do we want to go with steam catapult, or do we want to only rely on short takeoff and landing / vertical takeoff and landing craft? Well, 2012, they decided, you know what, going to a catapult and Cato bar recovery system, it's just not economical. Even though the aircraft carrier from the outset was designed to be quote-unquote future-proof and upgradable, it just didn't, it wouldn't come in at the cost. So even though they toyed with the idea of buying the naval F-35C, they ended up announcing they would buy the F-35B. And at one time they thought they would buy as many as 138 of the 35B, although this number has been reduced and increased and reduced and increased since then. One thing, in 2015, they finally announced that they were going to go ahead and complete HMS Prince of Wales. So at least by this point, both carriers' futures were assured. And finally, by this point, the F-35B was reaching operational readiness, finally, because the British Navy was really hurting for aircraft carriers and aircraft for a couple of years there. And so that gets us to our carrier today. So what is it? And well, let's talk about its specifications. Like I said, this is the largest warship that the Royal Navy has ever operated, and one of the largest in the world today. It's about 920 feet long and 230 feet wide, although at the waterline that decreases to under 130 feet and to spread out. And it's nearly 185 feet tall. It is about the same length as a Nimitz class in the U.S., but quite a bit lighter. But it is just a hair under 3 times heavier than the previous Invincible class, and has a range of about 10,000 nautical miles. It has 2 islands. The forward one is for navigating the ship, and the rear one is actually for air traffic control, as it were. And the hangar, pretty big, over 500 feet long, over 100 feet wide, and the height is anywhere from over 20 feet to over 30 feet, depending on exactly where you're at. It has 2 elevators, each capable of lifting either 2 F-35Bs at once or 1 Chinook helicopter with the blades ready to go. And it has a standard air group of 24 F-35Bs, although it can support up to 36, even maybe up to 40 in an absolute emergency, but 24 is standard, although some cruises have that as low as 16. And it can support an assortment of helicopters, like I said, Chinooks, Apaches, Wildcats, which is the modernized version of the Lynx. But it seems like the Merlin, the A101, the HM2, the Mark II, is the standard. And the standard complement is around 14, with about 9 in an anti-sub role, and anywhere from 4 to 6 in an airborne early warning role. They can also carry out utility transport duties, more mundane but very critical things. This can also carry up to 250 Royal Marines, more in an emergency. And to help deploy them in a strike role, it carries 4 PTB ship's boats. That's over 40 feet long, and it carries a crew of 2, but it can carry up to 36 passengers per boat, meaning that all 4 boats will comfortably fit over 250 Marines for amphibious assaults. Pretty good. For defense, it has the Phalanx close-in weapon support system, basically anti-air missiles. There's 3 main batteries of those. It doesn't carry them, but it can be fitted with 30mm cannon and miniguns for surface defense against other ships. But so far, the mounts are there, but no guns on either ship in service. What else? She is not nuclear powered. They considered it, but there are many detractions to nuclear, including not being able to go through certain waters or dock at certain ports, and of course just the liability and complexity of nuclear. So instead, she has gas turbines and diesel engines, and has a normal max top speed of 25 knots, although in tests these have been put up to over 30 knots. Interestingly, while they have 4 main engines, power plants, there's actually just 2 screws, which is, I don't know, I find that kind of fun. 2 props back here. So kind of while I like full hull, you can see the propellers and things. Standard ship's crew is about 670 to 680 officers and men, plus the air group and plus Marines, and that can vary. She has 470 cabins with a total of 1,600 bunks, so some are definitely double bunking or more. Of course, officers, and this is the Royal Navy we're talking about, definitely get their own. And there's quite a few amenities on board. They have a theater, they have a chaplain, a church, basically a chapel. There's a full-fledged medical facility with a dental office and surgery. It can easily support over half a dozen patients and more in an emergency. In fact, there's a dozen people on the medical staff alone. There's also 4 galleys with nearly 70 people servicing those. They can deliver many meals a day. You have 4 or 5 gyms on board, other recreational facilities. Yeah, it's pretty well appointed as far as that goes. For early warning, the radar systems can pinpoint targets at 400 kilometers or more, and it can track up to 1,000 targets. Yeah, carriers are themselves big targets, so they have to have defense. Of course, this would be the head in a full group with escort and other defensive vessels, so these would not be alone. As I said earlier, she does not have a catapult, so they use the traditional ski jump. In theory, I guess she could be fitted with them. It's just a cost thing. These could support up to 70,000 tons, although, like I said, they're 65. That was just for the whole future-proofing thing, so they can add new technology and new electronics or even new armor, whatever they might need. A pretty well thought-out boat, for being straight, and pretty much designed from the get-go to operate the F-35B, so it integrates quite well. The earliest plans for building these were set down in 2005. In 2007, a big milestone, they ordered 8 of these big old power plants, which are the biggest ones ever ordered by the Royal Navy, 4 for each carrier. In 2008, the money was kind of found and contracts signed. And like I said, in 2009, construction began. This involved over half a dozen shipyards, over 10,000 people, nearly 100 companies, firms worked on these. Again, with the Aircraft Alliance group there being headed by Thales and BE Systems, but tons of others. It basically took all of England to make this happen, which explains why the British are understandably very proud. And it kind of goes alongside the Chinese and the Japanese and others upping their carrier forces as we move into the 2020s. So with that, let's talk a bit about service. Both Queen Elizabeth and what would become Prince of Wales were ordered in 2008. Now, Queen Elizabeth, work would begin in the summer of 2009, but in 2010 they weren't sure what they were going to do. They really just thought they needed one carrier, and so they were kind of trying to find ways of backing out of Prince of Wales, or what would become Prince of Wales. We'll call it R09. So its future was really uncertain, as was, like I said earlier, if it would have a catapult or ski jump. Well, they just didn't really know. And so they were honestly about ready to cancel it, but then they realized, look, the penalties for calling off the contracts with all these companies, it would literally cost more to cancel than to just finish her out. So work was underway by 2011, and it would slowly speed up. By 2014, some major progress was being made on 09 here. Queen Elizabeth would launch later that year for fitting out, and would be commissioned into the Royal Navy at the end of 2017, becoming flagship and pride of the fleet. Around that time, her sister here was getting close. In 2016, she was mostly done. 2017, they decided to go ahead and launch her. Basically, they went back and forth. By 2012, they already knew they decided they wanted 2 carriers. They just had to kind of figure out how to make that work. The idea was one could be in port for repair, refit, and the other could be in the ocean. They even considered just sharing the same air group so they didn't have to have as many operational F-35s and helicopters. They considered finishing her and then just putting her into mothballs or selling her to a friendly foreign power. But finally in 2015, they announced that they needed both carriers, and then in 2017, she was considered essential. So now she's for sure happening. Now the name. They didn't really know what to name her. In fact, there was talk about maybe HMS Ark Royal, since the original ship had been retired. But in September, HMS Prince of Wales, named after the World War II ship, was given, and then a short time later she would leave for fitting out. That would happen throughout 2018, and then around September of 2019, the first aircraft would land on her. That would actually be a Merlin helicopter. After that, she would take off for engine trials and kind of final fitting out, and she would be commissioned at the end of that year. And so her service would begin. Although 2020 wasn't a great year for Prince of Wales. Well, join the club, right? In February of 2020, she made her first port call. That was to Liverpool, so obviously a Beatles fan. And the year started off okay. I think we can all say that. But by May, when things were really getting crappy for us, they were bad for her too. She experienced what the Navy said was minor flooding, although later reports say it might have been more like moderate flooding. A little bit of repair back to sea, but then in October, more flooding, and this did major damage to electrical systems and some others. So as it turns out, in 2020, she spent only about 30 days in open water and had to go in for repair and refurbishment for nearly 6 months. So various things, including testing of the F-35B, had to be postponed. 2021, she was pretty much laid up, and her sister was commanding the fleet. But finally, January 1st, 2022, this year, she relieved HMS Queen Elizabeth and became the flagship, the lead ship of NATO's task force, and started operating. Seems like the flooding issues have finally been addressed. She had first went to Norway to work and kind of let her crew train up, and then would do operations in the Baltic and the Arctic. She also did maneuvers with the Turkish Navy, who will take over in 2023, and that's where she's at this year. She is headship of the NATO task force, and as far as I know, she's doing pretty good. And that means because they have 2, Queen Elizabeth can go back for upgrades, repair, refit, whatever. They can alternate between them. So it does make a lot of sense, if they can afford it, which they seemingly have, to operate 2 carriers, not just one. And the Merlin helicopters are doing well. There is the HM2, and then there's the HC4, which is the more cargo-oriented version. This model is from, I can't remember, Altea, Atlas, DeAgostini. It's that whole IXO model. It's fine. These are inexpensive diecast. The F-35B is from Hobbymaster, and these are pretty nice for what they are. Relatively small aircraft, but unlike the Harrier, this is supersonic. So she has 2 very good aircraft on board. Maybe not the best in the world, but very good. And yeah, not much to say. It's nice to see that Britain can still build a good ship, and it took the whole country to do it, but that's okay. That's the kind of thing that brings a country together, and it kind of restored the Royal Navy's place in the world. Keep in mind, they were one of the very first users of aircraft carriers, and they're one of the oldest navies in the world, and they had the most kind of honor and vintage, so it was kind of a shame for them not to be operating carriers for the second half of the 20th century. I know, they had the through decks, but I don't know. kind of nice to see them have something to rival what China is fielding or, I don't know, sailing these days. So what do you think? This is neat, and because it came out of nowhere, I'm really happy with how Corgi has done this. To be fair, for what these cost, I think I paid $65, $70 for it. They should be all metal, but they are. It's just about 9 inches long as a ship, and maybe just a little under 3 inches wide. Sure, you know, a 1/700 scale would be even neater, but probably if they did that, it would have to be a lot more plastic. So it's fine. At least they're doing something unique. Now, I hope they don't just stop with these two. I hope they do. I'd love to see the Invincible class, maybe the HMS Hermes, maybe the old Ark Royal. I'd love to see them just kind of do British carriers. I mean, if they want to do battleships, that's fine, but we've seen British battleships. Other makers, Eagle Moss and De Agostini, have done most of the modern, including Dreadnought, battleships, but very few British carriers available. In fact, I think I only have 2 others. No, 3 others. And we'll probably revisit those in a upcoming video. I won't display it waterline, but I'm glad they gave the option, because some people, that's what they do, is waterline. And like I said before, I'm glad that this isn't the real thin plexiglass cover, that it's actually a quality one. Probably don't want to run it over with a car, but the whole thing does feel substantial. Even the base is pretty thick. But I don't know if anyone else has done a video on this, so I thought, why not? And I really hope I hope Corgi does more. And when Elizabeth comes out, I'll talk more about her service, but thought we'd save it for that video, because I ordered both. Actually expecting the other one to come in before, but c'est la vie. Love to know what you think. As always, if you could, please like, share, and subscribe. This is Misha. Catch you very soon next time.